Hello, you're listening to Send in the Experts with Georgina Durrant. This podcast is all about teaching and supporting children and young people with special educational needs and disabilities, SEND. I'm Georgina Durrant. I'm the host of this podcast, brought to you by Twinkle SEND. As a former teacher in SENDCo myself, I wanted to create a platform to share some of the amazing things that my guests are doing to support learners with SEND. So whether you're listening on your commute, tuning in whilst walking your dogs, or curled up on the sofa with a nice cup of coffee, thank you so much for joining it. In this episode, I have the real pleasure of speaking to Cathy. Cathy is CEO of Autistic Girls Network, a charity supporting and campaigning for autistic girls and their families. She's part of a neurodivergent family and understands the struggle to get accommodations for SEND because, in her own words, she's in the thick of it for her own family. Hi, Cathy. Lovely to meet you. How are you?
Hi, I'm fine, thank you. And thank you for having me.
You're very welcome. So, autism in girls finally seems to be a bit of a hot topic.
Yes.
And I know our listeners of teachers, head teachers, TAs, SENDCos are going to be really keen to learn more about supporting autistic girls in their schools and classrooms. I think your Autistic Girls Network is absolutely brilliant.
Oh, thank you.
There must be so many families and young people so grateful for everything you're doing. And it's quite a network. I believe you've got over, 7,000 members on your Facebook group?
We've got 8,500 members in our Facebook group, yes.
Wow, that's a lot of people that you're supporting.
It is a lot of people, yes.
Could you tell our listeners what the Autistic Girls Network is then, in case they haven't heard about it yet?
Yes, sure. So Autistic Girls Network has been around for about three to 4 years now. I can't even remember. It wasn't founded by me. It was founded by another lady called Mandy, who had multiple autistic children, but it took a lot longer for her daughter to receive an autism diagnosis than for her sons. And this is very, very common. Mm-hmm. Research shows on average an autism diagnosis is about 3 years later for girls than for boys. And obviously when you're a child, 3 years makes an awful lot of difference.
Absolutely.
Not to mention that it takes such a long time to get a diagnosis at the moment anyway, especially after COVID. There are some areas in England where it's taking 4 years to get an autism diagnosis. And that's for everybody. So on average, girls are going to be longer than that. So I took it over about 2 years ago now.
Okay.
And really wanted to turn it into a registered charity, which I'm very pleased to say happened last month.
Brilliant.
So that was great. That has been months in the waiting for the Charities Commission. And what we hope to do is, of course, spread awareness and understanding about autism in girls. And perhaps I will expand on that in a little bit in a minute to say that it's not just girls that we're talking about here.
Okay.
But also to campaign for an earlier diagnosis. Yeah. So that means talking to health professionals as well and local authorities, which we are starting to do. Also to really make a difference in the mental health side of things. Yes. Because unfortunately, I would say a majority of the families in our Facebook group do have dealings with CAMHS because their children do have mental health issues. And not all, of course, but many of these mental health issues are caused by a late diagnosis and by schools not understanding their autistic needs, basically. The other thing that we'd really like to do is to start face-to-face groups for girls, because what we've found, and what I have found personally as well with my own daughter, who is autistic, is that finding your tribe and really getting to know other autistic teens and peers really makes a difference, because you realise, all that time you've been thinking that you're weird and that there's nobody else like you and that you don't fit in. And suddenly you realise that there are, in fact, lots and lots of other people like you, and that really makes a difference. And so that's the message that we'd like to spread. Be aware that other people experience the world differently to you.
Yes. Oh, that's lovely. Absolutely brilliant. So these face-to-face sessions then, what's your hope? Are you going to have them sort of across the country, different sort of hubs?
I mean, eventually, obviously, we can't run before we can walk, and at the moment we don't have any funding, so it's not happening at the moment.
Okay.
But what we'd like to do is to start them in areas where there isn't already a good group. We're certainly not going to go in and compete where there's already a good group.
Need.
That would be silly. But yes, we'd like to start them in areas where we know that there are a lot of autistic girls, which is just about everywhere, really. And we'd like to start them, and they would be run on a kind of a reverse franchise basis, if you like. So obviously we can't personally staff them all, but we would be looking for volunteers who could be DBS checked, etc., and who would follow a format that we come up with, and we fund it so that it can reach girls that otherwise really aren't being supported very well.
Yeah, that's wonderful. I hope it goes well. So your background then, why are you so passionate? You touched on that your daughter's autistic. Is that what led you into this?
Yes, I'm both my children are autistic. I've got a boy and a girl, and both of them weren't diagnosed until they were in their teens.
Right.
So for my daughter, I'm not going to go into her story because that's her story, not mine.
Mm-hmm.
But mental health definitely played a part.
Yeah.
In a kind of a she was diagnosed in crisis, basically,
right.
And this follows a pattern that we see over and over again in the Facebook group, where even if flags have been raised and that perhaps they are on the waiting list, they aren't getting the support that they should be getting in school.
Okay.
The schools aren't really putting in any meaningful reasonable adjustments for them until they get diagnosis, which actually isn't what's supposed to happen. But it's causing mental health issues.
Absolutely.
And a lot of it is to do with sensory stuff, but not always, because really good assessment is needed to find out, for example, do they have poor working memory? Are things like interoception, which is how you feel things in your body.
Yes.
Is there an interoception issue? Do they have alexithymia, which is being able to identify and express your emotions?
Yeah.
What we have found is that those three things are the biggest issues. Mm-hmm. And once you get some knowledge and understanding around those three things, you can start to make a difference.
Absolutely. So your hopes for schools then would be that there'd be more training, presumably more understanding of autism in girls, so that children can be identified sooner rather than waiting until they're in their teens.
Yeah, I mean, there is already good training available. Training is available from the Autism Education Trust. Mm-hmm. So it's not like anybody has to invent the wheel now. That has been around for quite a few years. It has autistic involvement. And it is partially funded by the D of E, as far as I know. Now, it's not completely free, but I think most LAs do offer at least the first level of AET training to schools, but a lot of schools don't take it up. So right. I would say that there needs to be a willingness to learn, and it also needs to be a whole school.
Yes,
whole school awareness. It's not going to happen properly if it's only cascading down from one person.
Yeah. Absolutely. So Autistic Girls Network used to be called FIGS UK, is that right? Fighting Inequality for Girls on the Spectrum. So why did the name change? Is there a reason behind that?
I mean, partly it was pragmatic reasons. I'm in marketing. I run a digital marketing agency, totally separate from Autistic Girls Network. It's what pays my bills at the moment. And, in terms of attracting people who are just looking on the internet or just searching Facebook, it makes much more sense to have
the word autistic in there.
Have the word autistic and girls in the title. And perhaps now is a good time to say that it's not only girls that we want to help. There is no female type of autism. That doesn't exist. Some girls present classically, you might say, although I don't really like that term either. Some girls present in a more external way, which tends to get recognised, but the majority of girls and some boys and some non-binary children have an internal presentation, and that's what is happening here in most of these cases. The presentation of autism is very, very internalised, so you're not really seeing the kind of behaviours which make it obvious that the child is autistic, and that's why they weren't diagnosed when they were 3 or 5 or whatever. But it is possible to spot or to start having thoughts about whether they do have an internalised presentation of autism, and things like situational mutism, where they are unable to speak if they don't feel that they're in a safe environment, things like extended absence from school, things like, never putting their hand up in class or being very reluctant to be called upon in class. All of those things by themselves, of course, are not autistic traits, but when you add them all together, it is time to start wondering whether that girl is autistic.
Okay, brilliant. That sort of leads on to my question, because I was going to ask for our listeners, because there'll be SENDCos, there'll be teachers listening who are thinking, how am I going, if it's internalised, how will I know if there's a child in my class who could be autistic? So you would say looking for those things, looking for a collection of these things, them not putting their hand up very often.
Going to be things like, as soon as there are mental health issues, that is, you need to be thinking about whether there is autism or perhaps ADHD behind it. As I said, situational mutism is a big flag, and I deliberately don't use the term selective mutism because it's not a choice.
No,
it's that child is feeling very, very unsafe, and that is why they won't speak. And eventually they will, once they feel safe, they will start to speak again. But it's definitely, I couldn't say if a child is situationally mute, they must be autistic, of course. No. But it's definitely something that raises flags for me. And there will be other things, things like friendships. Girls do tend to have friends, and just like autistic boys can have friends, of course they can. But it tends to be more kind of on the edges of a friendship group, not taking leadership of a friendship role. And as they get older, friendships do become more difficult. I guess because, social roles of girls particularly become more difficult as well as they get older. Puberty gets in the way, they start thinking about boys, etc. And a lot of autistic girls wouldn't necessarily be thinking about those things yet. So when all of that starts to change and the kind of the tone of their friendship group starts to change, that causes anxiety for autistic girls because they don't really know what's going on and why their friends are changing. Yeah,
no, that makes sense, because I think teenage, in particular, girls' sort of friendships do become quite complex, don't they? There's like nuances that you don't understand perhaps if you're autistic, and it can become difficult. That does make sense. There's lots of incorrect stereotypes of autism for boys and girls. Are there any in particular for girls that you would like to flag up that aren't true? For example, lack of empathy. I think that's one that is a
lack of empathy is a huge one. Yeah. I mean, autistic people generally can, there's a wide variety, just as there are. We're all human, aren't we? We're all different. We all have different levels of empathy, different levels of understanding of other people, all of us, no matter what our neurotype. But, if I had to generalise, I would say that autistic girls are more empathetic than their neurotypical peers. It may express itself in a different way. And, it's back to remembering that other people experience the world in a different way to you. So, for an autistic girl, the feelings of an animal or, I don't know, a soft toy, a cuddly toy, may be just as important as the feelings of one of their friends or one of their classmates. And when you open your mind to the idea of people feeling different ways, there's nothing wrong with that.
Absolutely not.
So they can be very, very intensely empathetic to the point where it's actually painful, and they feel emotions in a big way, shall we say.
Oh, yeah. Another one I was going to ask was about special interests, because for autism in boys, there's often, I know again stereotypically, they can have special interests. Do we see that as much with girls?
I mean, for girls, what tends to happen, and perhaps this is a reflection of the way society brings girls up, is that they tend to have special interests that are more in line with their peers.
Yeah.
So, for example, might be, I don't know, K-pop or something, Korean pop, might be animals, might be Harry Potter, but they will feel those interests very intensely.
Yeah.
So, for example, at the time, my daughter was diagnosed when she was 13. Up to that point, we didn't really know. Nobody had ever flagged that she was autistic. She's actually autistic and ADHD and dyspraxic and dyslexic. None of those were ever flagged by any professional. Even after she had her autism diagnosis, the other 3 were not flagged by any professional. So, these girls are going invisible.
Yeah, let down completely.
In our schools. And, she wasn't diagnosed as dyslexic until this year. She's 16 now. She wasn't diagnosed as dyslexic until this year. And this, in the last week, because she's already been on holiday for a week, in the last week, she has read a book that was in a dyslexia font. And that's the first book that she's ever actually lay on the sofa and read from cover to cover. She didn't actually enjoy it, which is a shame. But still, she read it.
She read it. Or how disappointing that she could have had, if it was flagged up sooner, she could have had access to texts that were dyslexia friendly earlier on, and may have developed a love of reading.
She may have done. She certainly may have had an awful lot less issues at school.
Yeah,
shall we say? Sorry, I've now forgotten what you actually asked me.
No, it's okay. Her special interest. I think you were going to give an example.
Yes,
perhaps, of her special
I
interest.
couldn't really tell you what her special interests were.
Right.
And all the stereotypes of like lining up toys and things, lining up cars and trains and things. When I think back, she used to line up Monster High dolls, but at the time. Never occurred to me that was anything, different to her peers. Because, of course, you don't go and see their friends playing in their houses anyway, do you? So, your normal is your normal. No. So, not that there's anything wrong with lining up Monster High dolls anyway, or trains or cars.
No.
Now I'm very aware of her special interest, and it's actually a highly autistic special interest, because she is passionate about I suppose minority groups and social justice.
Brilliant.
And that's a very, very common. Autistic people generally like to stick up for the downtrodden, shall we say?
Oh, that's wonderful.
And have a really, really strong sense of social justice. I personally think that ought to be a diagnostic trait of autism. And it's something that we should celebrate.
Absolutely.
It's a fantastic thing.
We need people like that, don't we? More people like that.
Exactly. Well, I mean, don't get me started. I think many of the really important things that have happened to the human race were probably due to neurodivergent people, I think. But of course, I can't prove any of that.
Perhaps a little bit too deep to go into now as well.
Yes.
What about sensory differences with girls as well? Is that, I know we've spoken about interoception, sort of internal ones, but in terms of like external, in terms of sensory differences, can they be oversensitive or undersensitive to sensory stimuli?
I don't think that this is something that can be generalised by gender. I think there's probably just as many boys who might have strong sensory issues, and I think it's very much an individual thing. Certainly for my daughter, sensory stuff, and my husband, who's also autistic, and to a lesser extent me, sensory is really, really important, and probably at times among the most disabling things for her. So she's very, very sensitive to noise. Probably, I mean, it's not diagnosed, but probably has misophonia, which is like very strong sensitivity, even painfulness at everyday noises.
Gosh.
So it's not like really loud, like a car alarm or something, although that would be painful. But, you know, even things like other people chewing, we don't sit at the dinner table in our house because it's painful for her.
Gosh.
And she wears headphones a lot, noise cancelling headphones a lot. So, I mean, that, you know, that's one of the things that definitely would be a reasonable adjustment for many autistic children in schools.
I imagine the dinner hall would be an absolute nightmare for some children.
I mean, she's not at mainstream school anymore. No. But when she was, for at least a year before she stopped going to school, she couldn't go in the dining hall. In fact, for the last 6 months, she didn't eat at school at all.
Oh, but that was incredibly worrying.
And that's, you know, that if that starts happening, that's also another flag. For autism, as is any kind of eating disorder.
Yes, absolutely. Now, I was reading on your blog, on your website, there was a specific blog I read yesterday written by Emily, who's autistic, and she's one of your trustees, I believe. And I'll freely admit, I was in tears reading it. It absolutely broke my heart. I don't know if it's because I've got a daughter myself, or if I just reading what she had written, I just found really, really upsetting, and how that she'd been failed by school. I don't think there's any other way of putting it, to be honest. And just the way that she felt about herself. And I'll read out one little bit for our listeners. She said, "I grew up believing that there was something fundamentally wrong about me. I knew I didn't seem to fit into the world. And because I couldn't pinpoint why, I believed it was me. I came to the conclusion that leaving this world was the best option." Now, it's horrifying, isn't it? It's something you hear a lot of.
Yes, we hear a lot of that. We hear it a lot. I have probably a week doesn't go by that I don't have a parent messaging me about something like that.
Gosh. So do you think this is down to later diagnosis or not being diagnosed at all?
My daughter thought that she was going mad because she knew that there was something different about her. But she didn't know what, and nobody had ever flagged autism, so it wouldn't have occurred to her that that's what it was. But of course, she hid it from us for a long time. We thought that she had OCD. Well, she does have OCD as well, but OCD is another thing that can be very internalised, and it's also something that happens a lot when autism is not recognised. So that kind of internal voice it gets dangerous. It really does. And of course, CAMS has its own problems and its own funding issues, etc. And the level of support that you can get when you have only, and that's on a podcast in inverted commas, only suicidal ideation rather than actually attempting it. Unfortunately, you don't get any support.
That's terrifying.
So, it is terrifying, and it kind of it's difficult because it's putting it all back onto the schools, really. I know many schools are desperate to get support from CAMS and don't get it. And it's, it's a very difficult thing.
So what,
undoubtedly,
what can be done?
The biggest thing that can help is really understanding autism and the internal presentation of autism. And there is a pilot project funded by NHS England, which I'm involved with my other hat on as my local parent care forum, called the Autism in Schools project. And the reason that is funded by NHS England is because of the high level of referral for Tier 4 CAMS, which is inpatient CAMS. And they recognise that, this is obviously causing a huge, inroad into their budget. It's all about the money, isn't it? Let's face it. And they recognise that it actually would be cheaper to fund the Autism in Schools project than it would to fund all of these young people going into Tier 4 CAMS units, of which there are not enough anyway. And it's really looking at educating school staff on autism and how it can present in a way that perhaps they weren't aware of before, in a less traditional, classic way than they were aware of before, but also working with parents and working with the local parent carer forums to set up mini parent carer forums in the schools, which will hopefully foster a better relationship between parents and schools. And also, depending on the project, because each local area will be doing theirs differently, but we're actually working on identity. So identity for the autistic young person and how they can recognise their identity and find their tribe and be more happy with themselves, basically, and be able to be their autistic self rather than mask their autism. We haven't actually really talked about autistic masking.
That's one of my next questions, actually, Cathy. So autistic girls are often said to be very good at masking. Can you explain to someone who might not know what masking actually is, what it is and why it's so draining? Because it can be incredibly draining for autistic girls or autistic people in general.
So autistic masking is consciously or unconsciously, the autistic young person has realised that they need to camouflage some of their autistic traits. And often this is completely unconscious. Certainly my daughter was an expert masker, but she never would have been able to say that she was doing it at the time. And it's really trying to fit in because of the stigma of being autistic, basically, which very much exists. It's trying to fit yourself in with your peers so that you don't stand out and you don't get bullied and you don't get teased. And it's hiding your authentic self. And it's a 24/7 effort for some autistic people. Well, I guess they're not doing it while they're sleeping, but you know what I mean. It's a huge effort, and not only is it completely exhausting, but it's also really, really bad for your mental health. Absolutely. Because you're hiding your identity, you're hiding your autistic self, and that's not going to be good for anyone's mental health, is it?
No, absolutely not. And do you think that's one of the reasons then, presumably, that girls and boys who are autistic, if they're masking, they're not getting diagnosed as easily because it's not as apparent?
Yeah, I mean, they're trying super, super hard to fit in. And so, it is going to be hard to spot them. And because for them, they feel like their life depends on it.
Gosh.
And then, it's very hard to drop the mask after that. So I would say it took my daughter probably a good year to drop the mask, even properly at home. And now at home, she is completely different to how she was, pre-13. I mean, I guess she would be anyway because she's obviously 3 years older. But, even so, she is completely different. And, it's when you're masking, you can't learn any of the things that you would otherwise have learned to do, such as self-regulate your emotions. So if you don't know that you have a big sensory issue and you don't realise that everyone else is not in pain from hearing people chewing, for example, because it is actual physical pain, as I said before, your normal is your normal.
Absolutely.
So you're not going to realise that somebody else doesn't feel that way as well. And so, of course, you're thinking, why isn't everyone else having a problem with this? It's just me. There's something wrong with me. I'm faulty.
How are they managing to sit there and listen to this sound that's causing them pain and not be acting the same way I feel?
Exactly. So, it's not surprising really that she thought she was going a bit mad.
That's interesting what you said about masking at home as well. I think a lot of people presume that they've heard like the Coke bottle scenario, the idea that at school you might mask, but then when you get home from school and you feel more comfortable, then that's when especially with younger children, that's when the emotions come out and the mask might, they might not be masking as much. Is that also something that can happen?
That's definitely something that can happen, but it can also become even more internalized, and that's where the serious mental health issues start coming, because you're even internalizing the trauma of the Coke bottle effect. And so that's when, you start hearing voices, etc., etc. It it is really, really important that these girls are recognised as autistic much earlier, because if knowing what we know now and understanding things like interoception and alexithymia, it allows you to not only upskill and educate everyone around your child, but to let your child be able to understand those things so that they can self-regulate themselves. So now, my daughter, for example, has kind of an internal checklist of things that she can do if she starts to feel really stressed and anxious. And I can still, it's still pretty obvious that she's really stressed and anxious. For example, she's just had her booster jab. And that makes her very stressed and anxious, and it's pretty obvious to me when she's in that state. But there are things that she can do. So she definitely needs vestibular movement. So she goes and paces up and down the garden, and that really helps her. But imagine all those years of being at school and having to keep still in class and things like that, when actually she should have been up and walking, and moving about. So and there's, that's, who knows what the actual prevalence of autism or neurodivergency in general is. It's certainly not the 1 in 100 that the National Autistic Society says.
Yeah, I was going to build on that, because I think you've mentioned, haven't you? Yeah, that they're saying it's 1 in 100, but you think it's probably more like. What did you? Well,
there are numerous studies in the US. We don't really seem to do that kind of study here, unfortunately. But the latest study in the US is 1 in 44, and that's by the CDC, so that's an official figure. But they were only counting 8-year-olds.
Right.
So there are a huge number of people, especially girls, who are not diagnosed until after they are 8. So it's not including any of those people.
Yeah.
So 1 in 44 is definitely wrong. It's definitely more than that. There has been a study in Northern Ireland, I think, which found something like 1 in 22.
Wow.
So, it's definitely much more common than we think it is.
And this matters because of funding, doesn't it? This is important for funding.
It matters hugely. National Autistic Society statistics are what is used to inform government policy and therefore funding.
Yeah.
So, not having the right figures really makes a big difference. I mean, the other issue is that there have been studies which show up to 70% of autistic people also have ADHD.
Yeah.
So, there's also all of that.
Yeah.
And the presentation of autism plus ADHD is slightly different again.
Right.
So, you've got all of those little intersectionalities, and you've also got things like people of colour not being recognised as being neurodivergent as well.
Right.
And so you've got all of those little inequalities, I guess, not being addressed, and people's needs not being met.
Yeah, absolutely. So when parents find you, are they at this crisis point when they find you when they find the Autistic Girls Network, or does it vary?
They often are, sadly.
Because it must be difficult for parents to be able to be, I think it's almost like we need more awareness in general in the whole of society about autism, so that people are more aware if their child is autistic and then are able to support them. I
mean, I would say probably, I'm just guessing here, but I would say probably like 70% of people that come to our group, their child is already having persistent absence from school, related to anxiety about school. And so, these parents are often being threatened with fines, etc., or having visits from the LA, or, all of those things which really add stress to an already incredibly stressful situation.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So in terms of how long they're waiting for the diagnosis, once the parents are thinking, okay, I think my child might be autistic, or once the school is thinking perhaps they're autistic, how long did you say they're waiting for an autistic diagnosis?
Up to 4 years.
Up to 4 years. And the dangers of that wait is mental health issues, as well as not understanding themselves and not having the accommodations put in place.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is that everyone is an individual. Every autistic person is an individual. Every neurotypical person is an individual, of course. And so really, until they are properly assessed, and I don't just mean an autism assessment, I also mean an OT assessment, a sensory OT assessment, a speech and language assessment, an educational psychologist assessment. Until they are properly assessed, you don't really know what somebody's needs are. So you can't meet them.
No.
It's really, you're just skimming the surface if you haven't actually found out what their strengths and their challenges are.
Yeah.
Until she had her sensory OT assessment, we really didn't understand just how important sensory was to my daughter, for example.
Yeah.
And not just bad things, not just finding things difficult, but also things which really helped. So, for example, she's got a really strong sense of smell, and the smell of, ironically, clean washing, which you can actually get from a Yankee candle.
Oh, brilliant.
Luckily, there's not much clean washing in my house, obviously.
I was going to say, with lots of teenagers, it might be a tricky one.
Those smells can also be used for emotional regulation. They really help. Yeah. So, it's not just finding things that are difficult, it's finding things which help too.
Yeah. Oh, that's lovely.
But unfortunately, in a school setting, especially a secondary school, especially a really big mainstream secondary school, they can be a toxic place for autistic people. There's no two ways about it. In a school with so many people in, I venture to say it would have been impossible for my daughter to be there any longer.
Is there anything, so if schools are listening now, is there anything they can do, knowing that there will be undiagnosed autistic children in their school? Is there any accommodations they can put in place to make the school sort of better in general? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah,
what could they be doing?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, for example, for a start, just understanding and awareness would really help. But there's things like fluorescent light bulbs.
Yeah.
They are awful. They are a sensory nightmare. They are noisy. They flicker. For a person with sensory issues, they are awful. But actually, they're not good for any of us.
No.
So getting rid of them in general would be good for all pupils, not just autistic pupils. Things like the school bell. The school bell can be very traumatic for autistic people. So finding an alternative to that would be good. Things like not having really over busy, chaotic corridors and classroom walls would help.
Yes, definitely.
Just make it a calmer place, a calmer sensory place. If people don't know already, there is a company called Studio 3, which does really good what's called low arousal training for schools. And it's basically making a very kind of low arousal sensory environment. Yeah. And you can't do that through the whole school, but you certainly can have an area that has a low arousal sensory environment, and you can certainly make the whole school a less chaotic, busy place. Yeah. So, all of those, the trigger points are going to be things like what I call the corridors of hell. Yeah. So every hour when you have to move lessons and you're suddenly thrown into a crowded corridor, a narrow corridor with hundreds of other pupils, that is an absolute nightmare for autistic people. So there's not really much that you can do about that for an undiagnosed person, but there certainly is for a diagnosed, or not necessarily diagnosed, but somebody that you recognise has special educational needs. But there's lots of other things too. And, I'm doing a master's at the moment in autism, and I did a special project over the summer on transition to secondary school, and there was some interesting stuff that came up from that, and it became obvious that it wasn't necessarily having a diagnosis that made a difference in transition, but it was having a really individualized plan. Yeah. So obviously they did have to know that the child had was on the SEND register maybe, or something. So they did have to know that the child had needs. They had to know what those needs were, but they didn't necessarily need a diagnosis.
No.
So out of 17 young people that took part in the survey, only 3 of them had a good transition to secondary school. And those 3 were the schools that had very, very good individualised transition plans for those children. But one of them was not diagnosed. So it wasn't to do with being diagnosed or not at primary school. It was to do with recognising and being aware of the need and making accommodation for that.
Yeah, and having those meetings between the primary school and the secondary school.
Yeah, and transition is it should be a long process as well.
Yeah.
For an autistic person, it could well last for 2 years, that transition. A year before and 2 years after. So you certainly, for an autistic student, or for somebody that you suspect is neurodivergent somehow, that transition should still be happening, right up until the end of year 7 at least.
Yeah.
You should still be putting special things into place for that pupil.
So teachers listening in primary schools at the moment, then they should be thinking, if they've got somebody in mind, they need to be thinking in year 5 really how they're going to start that transition to the next school. I know there are transition activities that do start in year 5, but even more so for that child.
Yes. And that child, what's really important as well is a person who really understands.
Yes.
I mean, it'd be better if it was more than one person, but at least one person who really understands and who can kind of mentor that child and who that child can go to if they have a problem. That was that came up as really, really important as well. And friends were important. And I wonder whether this was why my daughter didn't break down until year 8, is because she moved up with 17 people from it was a feeder school, her primary school. There were 17 of them that went to her school, and 2 of her really good friends were in her class. And we think, I've asked her about this since, and we think that insulated her from the otherwise perhaps really disabling effects of transition.
Yeah, absolutely.
On secondary school.
And what strikes me as well is when you're talking about, simple things that school could be doing, is it's not just beneficial to autistic children, it's beneficial to everybody.
Yeah,
it's
absolutely.
not, they're not extra. It's a bit like when you talk about making a school more dyslexia friendly, the benefits come for everybody. It's useful. There's no reason why you shouldn't be doing them. And simple things that don't cost very much, like you say about displays, not having really chaotic displays. I think I've probably been guilty when I was a teacher sometimes as well, as trying to make the walls look fun and exciting, but it can sometimes be really not beneficial to learning.
I think we're all guilty of that, aren't we? We want to make it look pretty.
Yes.
But it's we come back to the same thing every time, is we have to open our mind that other people experience things different ways, and the way that we think isn't necessarily the right way.
Yes.
There isn't a right and wrong way. There are just lots of different right ways.
Absolutely. I think that's really important. I wanted to touch on, so Melanie Sykes in The Guardian in November, she wrote that she said that the education system should be torn down and rebuilt. And I wondered what your opinion on that was, if you're quite as extreme as her.
I agree. No, I absolutely agree with her.
Yeah. What would you, if you tore it down then and rebuilt it, how would you rebuild it differently?
I wouldn't have, these huge schools. I mean, it's all very easy for me to say, isn't it? Because obviously I'm not in charge of the funding.
No, but in an ideal world.
I think most of the issues that schools and CAMs have are down to funding, and probably a lot of teachers would agree with that, I should think. But, what I really would like to change is the behaviourist thinking and the behaviourist attitude, that things must be punished and you must behave a certain way, and if you don't, you're being naughty, or things like that.
Yes.
I remember a few years ago, before she was diagnosed autistic, my daughter came home and she was really cross, and of course now I realise, strong sense of social justice, but she was really cross because they'd been doing a science experiment at school, and it was to do with sound, and they were producing a sound that humans weren't supposed to be able to hear, and she said that she could hear it.
Wow.
And the teacher didn't believe her, but she, very unusually for her, she pushed back and said, no, yes, she could hear it. because she could.
Yeah.
She wasn't lying. And the teacher thought that she was lying and being cheeky. I don't know. And she got a detention for it.
Oh my goodness.
And she was absolutely outraged at this. And so am I. When I think back on it, I'm really outraged.
Yeah.
And, the reason that happened was because that teacher couldn't understand that somebody experienced the world in a different way to them. And because they couldn't hear the sound, and because they'd been told that humans can't hear this sound because, everything is based on neurotypical society, they thought that she was lying and that she was being rude and cheeky.
Oh my goodness.
But so how invalidating must it be for a teacher to tell you that you can't hear a sound that
when you know
damn well you can hear that
sound. You've just heard it. Absolutely. Yeah, no, I can completely see that. So in terms of what you're doing, are you currently writing a book? Have I researched you correctly? I believe you're writing for the same publishers as me, so Jessica Kingsley Publishers, is that correct?
Yes, that's right.
Can you tell us more about your book? How much you're able to tell us?
I have the first draft is with my editor.
Very good.
Yes, it's a book for parents of late diagnosed children, so tweens and teens, basically, because I was going to say the pathway is different for if your child is diagnosed earlier, but actually the pathway is non-existent.
Yeah.
If your child is diagnosed, past about 10, really there's no automatic support that comes into place that otherwise might have happened if your child was diagnosed at, let's say, 3. I'm not saying that the support that you get when your child is diagnosed at 3 is great either, but it is better than when your child is diagnosed later. And of course, if your child is diagnosed later, then often things have got much more complicated because all of the issues that we've talked about have come into play.
Absolutely. So who is your book for, parents then, or for
It's for parents, yeah.
Brilliant. But obviously it'd be a useful one for teachers as well to check
out.
Yeah,
there'll be plenty in there for teachers too.
So for people who want to know more about Autistic Girls Network and autism in girls in general, can you give us some links? Where do they need to go?
Yes, so our website is autisticgirlsnetwork.org. And our Facebook page is called Autistic Girls Network. So if you just search that, you'll be able to find it. On Twitter, it's slightly more complicated because the name was too long. And Autistic Girls is already gone. So it's Autistic Girls _ on Twitter. And on Instagram, it's Autistic Girls Network.
Fantastic. And if they wanted to, because you're a charity, so people may want to help support you, hopefully, from listening to this. If they wanted to support you, how can they do that?
Yeah, we do have a GoFundMe page, which is pinned to the top of our Twitter. Mm-hmm. We are always looking for volunteers. We would love people to come forward to say that they need a group in their area. And possibly volunteer to lead it. There would always be at least 2 leaders, so they wouldn't be stuck on their own.
Brilliant.
And we are just basically waiting to get funding for those, and then they will be off the ground. So.
Yeah. If there's a SENDCo or perhaps who's listening to this and thinking they want their school to know more about autism in girls, do you offer training to them? Could they get in contact with you as well? Yeah,
we can offer training, and actually one of our trustees is an ex-head.
Oh, wow.
And she's autistic herself, and we are currently thinking about the training that we can offer.
Fantastic.
So yes, there will be training coming up in 2021.
2022.
Oh, yes.
Don't worry.
2022. I'm a year behind already.
I was trying to work that out then with the podcast timing of when it comes out. It's like 2021. Yeah, 2022. No, that's fine. So thank you ever so much for joining us. Is there any sort of ending remarks, anything that you want people to take away as a takeaway message about autism in girls in general?
Yes, I would. I know I've gone on about it, but I would just like to say, really open your mind. And, there are some good videos, and we have a resources page on our website, and we link to some of these videos. There are some good videos that give you more of an understanding of how an autistic person might feel in a very disruptive sensory environment. And I would say, have a look at those and just try to open your mind and just have a look around. Do do a walk around your school and do a kind of a sensory audit. I know it's hard when you don't necessarily understand yourself, and this is part of what we'll be offering in the Autism in Schools project, is a sensory audit. But just kind of walk around your school and see if you can find where the trigger points might be for somebody that's very, very sensitive to touch or noise or smell, and just try and see if there's anything that you could do to alleviate that a bit. And all of these things will start to make a difference.
Yeah, that's brilliant. Really good advice. Thank you ever so much for joining us, Cathy.
You're very welcome.
What an interesting guest and such an important topic. I don't know if you could hear it in my voice, but when I was reading out that extract from the blog post by Emily, one of their trustees, I found hearing her experience or reading her experience really, really upsetting. And it's made me think that we need to do a lot more, perhaps as a society. I think Cathy has given some really tangible, useful advice that schools can implement to help make a real difference to autistic children in their setting. So please do go and check out their website and the wonderful things they're doing. Once again, thank you for listening to Send in the Experts with me, Georgina Durrant. Please subscribe to our podcast if you're not doing so already, and help us spread the word about this podcast. See you next time.